There are places in America where the shadows stretch longer than the daylight, where silence itself feels heavy with unspoken truths. Places where a family name can echo like a curse, carried not by pride but by whispers. Tonight, we begin with one such name. This is not folklore. This is not some cautionary tale spun by firelight to frighten children. What you are about to hear is a record stitched together from dusty county files, from neighbors who swore they would never speak, and from fragments of memory buried so deep people hoped the mountain itself would keep them hidden forever. At the heart of this record lies a single, shattering truth. A girl gave birth to her own father's child. That sentence alone might seem enough to chill the blood, but the truth stretches far darker. Because this was no accident. No singular moment of sin and shame. It was a cycle, carefully guarded, whispered into the ears of daughters, carried out in the shadows, and passed from one generation to the next. To understand how it began, you must first step back into a time when isolation was not simply a choice but the way of life. The Appalachian hollows of the early 1900s were lands carved by hardship. Roads were scars of mud etched into ridges, cut off by rains that turned paths into rivers. Winter transformed villages into prisons of snow, where a lantern burning in a neighbor's window, 5 miles through the forest, looked as distant as a star. It was in McDowell County, West Virginia, that the Hollister name first began to spread uneasily through the hills. A name that locals remember not with pride, not with familiarity, but with a shiver that passes down the spine. For by the time the 1920s had crept into the mountains, Jeremiah Hollister had become the sort of man you did not question. Tall and gaunt, his face carved hollow by grief after the death of his wife, Jeremiah clung to his daughter Martha with the desperation of a drowning man gripping driftwood. At first, the townsfolk explained it away. A father shielding the last of his family. A man broken by tragedy who could not bear to let his child out of his sight. But grief, no matter how deep, does not usually fester into secrecy. And whispers began to slip through the night air like smoke from a dying fire. Whispers that told of how Martha rarely appeared in town. That when she did, her eyes were fixed to the dirt, her arms folded across her chest as though hiding something unseen. An elderly woman named Elinana Davis, who as a child once glimpsed the girl, would recall decades later, she never looked you in the eye. It was like she wasn't allowed to. By the late 1920s, the silence grew complete. Martha all but disappeared. Jeremiah was the only Hollister seen in the markets, descending from the mountain with that listless expression carved into his face. He bought flour, salt, cloth, kerosene, and nothing more. To questions about his daughter, he offered only 3 words, always the same, she's tended. But in 1928, the silence cracked. The county clerk recorded a note scrawled crudely in Jeremiah's own hand. 3 words. Female child, Martha. There was no doctor, no midwife, no father listed. Just the cold announcement of a birth, delivered by Jeremiah himself with a glare so sharp it dared anyone to ask a single question more. The townsfolk did not ask. They whispered. They whispered that the child was Jeremiah's. That in that cabin on the mountain, father and daughter were locked into a cycle no one dared name aloud. The more they avoided the truth, the heavier it became, pressing down on the county like a stone. And yet, no one spoke. No one stepped forward. No one broke the silence. Let me ask you something. If you had lived in that town, would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked away, telling yourself it was not your business, that you had your own family to feed, your own burdens to carry? Because that is the choice they made. And it was that silence that allowed what happened next. By the early 1930s, hunters trudging through the forest swore they had seen pale children darting between the trees. Children with hair as white as Jeremiah's. They told of stumbling into a clearing where firelight revealed the old man, his daughter, and two small figures gathered around the flames. The children's eyes, they said, reflected the firelight like shards of glass. And when Jeremiah spotted them, he raised his rifle. His voice cracked across the night air, "Ain't no call for you here." The hunters fled, but the memory clung to them. Years later, their voices still shook when they told the story. And yet they never went to the sheriff, never raised alarm. The Hollisters were left alone on their mountain, left to sink deeper into silence. But the story does not end in that clearing. What the hunters saw was only the surface of a darkness that had already taken root generations before. To understand how Martha became ensnared, you must understand Jeremiah himself. Jeremiah was not born cruel. Neighbors remembered him as a boy in the late 1800s, quiet but hardworking. His family had lived in the same hollow for decades, bound by the soil, by poverty, by blood. And it was that last tie, blood, that ran thicker than any outsider might imagine. You see, Jeremiah's own mother was not the wife of his father, but his father's sister. The Hollisters had already carried the mark of inbreeding before Jeremiah was ever born. In those years, when roads were impassable and communities clung tightly to themselves, such unions were not spoken of, but neither were they unheard of. What made Jeremiah different was not that he was born of it, but that he carried it forward deliberately. After his wife's death, the whispers say something broke inside him. He spoke of family as if it were the only law, as if nothing existed beyond the bloodline carved into his own name. And Martha, trapped in that cabin, became both daughter and prisoner to the creed her father believed. When she gave birth, no doctor touched the child. No midwife cut the cord. Only Jeremiah's hands delivered it, and only Jeremiah's voice carried the announcement into town. He did not hide it, but he did not confess it either. The people of McDowell County lived in that fragile space in between knowing and pretending not to know. Because to speak it aloud would mean taking responsibility. It would mean climbing the mountain with torches and lawmen and tearing apart the cabin brick by brick. And no one wanted to be the one to do it. So the secret lived. It breathed. And the silence that kept it alive became the very soil in which the next generation of Hollisters grew. Now, imagine that silence. Imagine being Martha, raised by a father whose grief turned to obsession, trapped in a home where walls kept out the world and kept her inside. No school, no church, no neighbors. Only Jeremiah's voice telling her that blood was all that mattered. Do you think she believed it? Or do you think, in the depths of her heart, she screamed for escape? That, we may never know. But what we do know is this. In 1928, the cycle was passed on. A child was born. A child that carried within them the darkest inheritance imaginable. And the town looked away. But cycles like this do not remain hidden forever. Time erodes silence. Memories spill out. And sometimes, the land itself refuses to bury what it knows. This is only the beginning. Because what the hunters glimpsed in the 1930s, the pale children flickering in firelight, was only the first sign of what the Hollister family would become. The woods remember. Even when people turn their backs, even when whispers die out, the forest keeps its own record. Every hollow, every ridge, every cabin with smoke curling up from its chimney, it all soaks in the truths that people try to bury. And in McDowell County, those truths did not stay buried forever. By the 1930s, the Hollister name had become a stain. People avoided speaking it aloud, but when they did, it was never without a shudder. Hunters told of pale children slipping between the trees like ghosts. Travelers swore that strange figures watched them from the ridges. And though no one would admit it openly, the suspicion was the same. Jeremiah had fathered children with his daughter Martha. But the truth was worse. Because what no one outside that cabin could see was the way Jeremiah had turned his grief into a doctrine. He did not merely control Martha, he preached to her. He told her that the bloodline was sacred, that outsiders would corrupt it, that she was chosen to keep the family whole. His words were scripture in that house. His presence, law. Martha, a girl robbed of childhood, grew into a woman who knew nothing of the world beyond those walls. To her, Jeremiah was not just father. He was warden. He was preacher. He was the architect of a prison built not from iron bars but from shame, fear, and obedience. The child born in 1928 did not remain the only one. Records suggest that 2 more followed in the years after, each noted by Jeremiah in the same blunt fashion. Each scrawled into the county's files like some cruel reminder: male child, Martha. Female child, Martha. No doctor ever saw them. No midwife ever signed a certificate. Only Jeremiah's grim handwriting marked their existence. And still, the town did nothing. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the unspoken rule of mountain life. What happens on a man's land is his business. Or perhaps it was something darker, a willingness to let silence serve as a shield, so long as the horror stayed up there on the ridge and not in their own homes. But silence is never neutral. Silence is complicity. The 1930s passed, and the children grew. They were seen only in fragments, pale faces caught in the glow of a fire, thin bodies slipping through the trees like shadows. They spoke to no one. They came to town only through the eyes of hunters who wished they hadn't seen them. And through it all, Jeremiah grew older, more skeletal, his presence twisting into something almost spectral. It was said that if you passed him in town, his eyes would fix on you like a hawk's. He did not speak much, but when he did, his voice cut sharp, carrying an unspoken warning. Do not ask, do not pry. And people obeyed. But behind those closed walls, the cycle tightened. Martha, broken into obedience, raised the children as Jeremiah commanded. They were not told of school. They were not told of church. They were not told of the world outside the ridge. Their only lessons were Jeremiah's words: blood must stay pure. Outsiders cannot be trusted. Family is everything. Generations of silence began to feed on themselves. By the 1940s, when war tore across the world and even the most isolated towns sent sons to fight, the Hollister Ridge remained untouched, frozen in its own private hell. Young men from McDowell went overseas and came back with stories of Europe, of cities, of the wider world. But on the ridge, nothing changed. Martha grew older, her body hollowed by childbirth and submission, her spirit worn into silence. Jeremiah's hair turned white, his frame brittle. Yet his control never weakened. The children, now growing into teenagers, were something different entirely. Locals who spotted them at a distance spoke of a strangeness about their movements. Too still, too watchful. Their pale hair made them look ghost-like against the trees, and their eyes, those eyes that caught firelight like glass, were said to be unsettling, empty, as though they had never learned the natural language of human expression. Some said they looked more like shadows than children. It is here that the second layer of silence took hold. Because by the 1940s, enough people had seen enough signs to know what was happening. Yet by then, it was not just Jeremiah's glare that kept them quiet, it was shame. The town itself bore the weight of knowing and doing nothing. To acknowledge it aloud would be to admit their own guilt. And so they looked away. But the children could not be hidden forever. There is one account, from 1946, of a traveling salesman who claimed to have gotten lost near the ridge. He swore that, as he searched for the road, he came upon a small clearing where 3 figures stood watching him. He described them as children, though their faces looked wrong. Their features blurred, their eyes too large, their skin too pale. He told the sheriff what he'd seen. The sheriff nodded slowly, thanked him, and told him to move along. The report never made it into any official ledger. But the story survived in the salesman's own words. They didn't look at me like children. They looked at me like they were hungry. By the time Jeremiah's life was waning, the silence of the community had stretched so far that the Hollister Ridge had become more myth than memory. People avoided it. Parents warned children never to wander that way. But no one intervened. No lawmen ever climbed the slope. No preacher ever carried a Bible to the cabin door. And when Jeremiah finally died, sometime in the late 1940s, no one even marked the day. His body was buried by Martha and the children in the woods, under stones stacked in silence. No gravestone, no prayer, just a mound of earth, hidden in the trees. You might think his death would free them, that the chain would snap, the silence would break, and Martha, long imprisoned by his will, would finally escape. But by then, the cycle had already taken hold. The children, his children, her children, were no longer just victims. They were believers. They had been raised on Jeremiah's words, nourished only by his creed, and when he died, they carried his law forward. For them, the doctrine was clear. Outsiders could not be trusted. Family was everything. Blood must remain pure. And so, in the wake of Jeremiah's death, the pattern did not end. It deepened. Now, Martha herself became both victim and enforcer. She was the one who whispered the doctrine to her children, the one who told them the outside world would destroy them, the one who bound them to the very chains she had once suffered under. Not out of malice, but out of fear of breaking the only truth she had ever known. And so the cycle turned again. It is at this point in the record that the whispers grew darker still. Whispers that the children of Jeremiah took Martha as Jeremiah had. That the bloodline, already poisoned by silence, twisted in upon itself again. No clerk recorded these unions. No outsider witnessed them. But the evidence lies in what came after. By the 1950s, there were more children in the woods. More pale faces with white hair. More eyes catching the firelight. Hunters spoke of them in hushed voices, saying they moved like shadows, that they appeared where no one expected and vanished without a sound. The cycle had not broken. It had doubled. And through it all, the town remained silent. Perhaps by then they told themselves it was too late. That what had begun could not be undone. That the Hollisters were beyond saving. And so they turned their backs entirely. But silence, once it becomes habit, is nearly impossible to break. The Ridge became a ghost story. Parents told their children never to wander near the Hollister land. Old men muttered warnings in taverns. But no one stepped forward. And as the years slipped by, the secret rotted deeper into the bones of the family. This is how cycles survive, not through strength, but through silence. What began as one man's grief turned to obsession. What began as one child's captivity turned to generations of shadows moving through the trees. And still, the worst was yet to come. Because in the decades that followed, the Hollister name would resurface, not in whispers, not in legends, but in files and reports that told the story in cold, unyielding ink. And when those records surfaced, the world would finally glimpse the darkest truth of all. By the 1950s, the Hollister Ridge had slipped fully into myth. To outsiders, it was just another patch of mountain land, one ridge among countless others in Appalachia. But to the locals of McDowell County, it was something else entirely. Parents warned their children not to wander near it. Hunters made wide circles around the cabin's territory. Travelers passing through might hear nothing of it at all, but those who lived nearby carried the truth in their bones. They knew the Hollister name, and they knew the silence it demanded. Still, silence can never hold forever. In 1953, A deputy sheriff named Clyde Jennings stumbled upon something while following up on an unrelated matter in the hills. He had been searching for signs of a missing hunter when he came across a path, overgrown and nearly hidden, leading deeper into the ridge. Curiosity drew him forward, and what he found would stay with him for the rest of his life. There, in a clearing, he saw 3 children. Pale-skinned, white-haired, their clothes ragged and stitched from coarse cloth. They stood together in eerie stillness, watching him from a distance. Clyde would later swear that their eyes reflected the daylight like mirrors. That they didn't blink. That they didn't move. He called out to them, but none answered. Instead, they turned silently, as though commanded by some invisible hand, and disappeared into the trees. Clyde never filed an official report. He told only the sheriff, who shook his head and told him to let it be. "That ridge ain't our business," the sheriff said flatly. And just like that, the silence folded itself back over the truth. But Clyde did not forget. In later years, long after he had retired, he told his grandchildren the story. His voice trembled as he described those pale figures in the trees. "They weren't children like ours," he said. "They looked like something the mountain itself spit out." The Hollisters were no longer just a family hidden away. They had become something else, something shaped by generations of inbreeding, isolation, and silence. And yet, Martha remained. By then, she was middle-aged, her body frail, her hair already streaked white. But her role had not changed. She was both mother and sister to the children, both victim and enforcer. She carried Jeremiah's creed like a torch, passing it to the children he left behind. Family is everything. Outsiders cannot be trusted. Blood must remain pure. It was not love that bound them. It was fear. Fear drilled into them from birth. Fear that the world beyond the ridge would destroy them. By the late 1950s, the family had multiplied again. More births, more children who carried the same pale features, the same uncanny stillness. The woods themselves seemed to thrum with their presence. People spoke of hearing faint voices in the night, echoing between the trees, though no one dared investigate. The county clerk's records from that era are a chilling testament to the silence. Sparse, scrawled notes appeared every few years, births attributed to Martha, long past the age when most women bear children. Female child, Martha. Male child, Martha. On and on, the handwriting shifted, becoming shakier as Martha aged, until finally the notes stopped altogether. No doctor ever signed them. No witness ever verified them. Only the Hollisters spoke for themselves. And the county let it stand. By the 1960s, America was changing. Highways carved through the mountains. Television brought the outside world into even the most remote hollows, and new industries moved into West Virginia's coal towns. But on the ridge, the Hollisters remained frozen in time. Stories began to circulate among construction workers who came into the county to blast new roads. They spoke of strange figures watching from the tree line, of children with white hair peering from the shadows, of an old woman who moved like a ghost between the trees, her eyes sharp and hollow. Some laughed it off as mountain superstition. Others avoided the area altogether. But for those who grew up in McDowell County, there was nothing funny about the stories. They knew the truth, even if they refused to say it aloud. And then came the tragedy that forced the silence to crack again. In 1963, a fire swept through part of the ridge. Whether it was sparked by lightning, by careless hunters, or by the Hollisters themselves, no one knew. But the flames licked through the trees and curled around the cabin. When it was finally smothered by rain, neighbors who ventured close enough to see swore the cabin had survived, but not unscathed. What they claimed to have seen in the ash and smoke would haunt them. Small bodies carried out of the cabin, limp and lifeless. Children, pale as bone. No death certificates were ever filed. No coroner inspected the remains. But the whispers spread like wildfire. Some of the Hollister children had perished in the flames. And yet, others had survived. In the years that followed, sightings grew more frequent. Teenagers who dared each other to wander near the ridge swore they saw pale figures watching them. Hunters told of finding crude shelters in the woods, filled with rough bedding and bones of small animals picked clean. The Hollisters had retreated deeper into the mountain, scattering like shadows. The cabin still stood, but it was no longer the only place they lived. The woods themselves had become their home. By the 1970s, the Hollisters were no longer just a family hidden away. They were a presence in the land itself. A presence that slipped between the trees, watching, waiting, surviving. Local authorities pretended it wasn't happening. The sheriff's office avoided the ridge entirely. Preachers stopped trying to carry their message up the mountain. Teachers warned children not to wander too far into the woods. But silence cannot erase what grows in the dark. In 1978, a hiker went missing in McDowell County. His body was never found, but his backpack was discovered near the ridge, torn open, the contents scattered. Some claimed it was animals. Others whispered something else. The family that had begun with Jeremiah and Martha had now stretched into generations. Their bloodline, twisted in upon itself, carried forward through decades of secrecy. They were no longer just whispers. They were a living, breathing legacy of silence. And the people of McDowell County knew it. By then, the Hollister Ridge had become more than a place. It was a wound, a scar on the land, a reminder of what happens when silence is chosen over truth, when fear is allowed to grow unchecked. But the story was not finished. Because in the 1980s, the Hollister name would resurface, not in whispers, not in ghost stories, but in the unflinching light of official investigation. And when it did, the darkest inbred secret of Appalachia would finally be dragged from the shadows. By the 1980s, the silence that had cloaked the Hollisters for generations began to unravel. Progress had finally reached the mountains. New highways carved through the ridges, coal operations pushed deeper into forgotten hollows, and outsiders, workers, reporters, curious drifters, found themselves brushing against the edges of the ridge that locals had avoided for decades. And with them came questions. What was really happening in that cabin? Who were those pale figures slipping through the trees? And why, when officials dug through county files, did they find birth records scrawled in the same hand, decade after decade, all attributed to a single name, Martha? The truth, long buried in whispers, began to surface in the cold light of investigation. It started with a social worker. In 1982, a tip reached the county office, an anonymous caller who claimed that children were living in the woods without schooling, without medical care, without contact with the outside world. The caller refused to give their name, but their words could not be ignored. For the first time in nearly a century, the silence cracked wide enough for law to slip through. When authorities climbed the ridge, what they found stunned even the most hardened among them. The cabin stood as it always had, sagging under the weight of decades, its roof patched with tar and cloth, its windows covered with boards. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, rot, and sickness. Mattresses lay on the floor, blackened with mildew. Pans of water collected from rain sat in corners. And everywhere, children. Pale, thin, their hair shock-white, their eyes wide and unblinking. Some crouched in corners, shielding themselves like animals. Others stared openly, their faces expressionless, as if studying the intruders. The investigators counted 7 children that day. 7, ranging from toddlers to teenagers. All bore the same features. All bore the same silence. Martha was there too. Old now, her frame bent, her hair entirely white. She sat in a chair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast down. She did not resist. She did not explain. She only whispered the same words Jeremiah once had. They attended. The investigation that followed peeled back layers of horror. Medical exams revealed what everyone had whispered but never proved. Generations of inbreeding had left its mark. Many of the children had deformities. Some struggled to walk. Others struggled to speak. Their development was stunted, their health fragile. But perhaps most haunting of all was their understanding of the world. They knew nothing of school, nothing of books, nothing of towns, highways, or the world beyond the ridge. Their only knowledge was family. Their only law was blood. Reporters caught wind of the case, and the Hollister name, long buried in the shadows, splashed across newspapers. The Inbred mountain family, they called it. The hidden children of Appalachia. Sensational headlines twisted the tragedy into spectacle. Outsiders read it as folklore, a grotesque curiosity from a forgotten corner of America. But for the people of McDowell County, it was no curiosity. It was a reckoning. Because the truth was this: the Hollisters had not hidden themselves. They had been hidden by silence. Every neighbor who had looked away, every sheriff who had turned his head, every clerk who had filed Jeremiah's scrawled notes without question. The entire community had built the walls of that prison brick by brick, not with their hands, but with their silence. And when the cycle was finally dragged into the light, it was already too late. The children were taken into state custody, though few would ever truly escape the scars of their upbringing. Martha was removed from the ridge, but she never spoke more than a few words to officials. She died not long after, buried in a county grave with no marker. The cabin collapsed within a few years, swallowed by vines and rot. Today, only stones remain, half buried in the dirt, covered in moss. But the land remembers. The silence remembers. Ask anyone in McDowell County about the Hollisters, and most will shake their heads. Some will tell you it's just a story, a mountain legend. Others will tell you it's best left buried. But there are still a few, old now, their voices trembling, who will whisper what they saw. Pale children moving through the trees, eyes catching firelight like glass. A father who clung to his daughter until his obsession became law. And they will tell you the hardest truth of all. It could have been stopped. Not by outsiders. Not by headlines. But by neighbors. By the people who saw the signs, who heard the whispers, and chose to look away. There are stories so grotesque, so taboo, that even speaking them feels like trespassing. But silence is not innocence. Silence is the soil in which horror grows. The Hollisters are gone now. The ridge has grown quiet. But the lesson remains, carved into the mountains like scars. Because there are some truths that should never see daylight. And yet, if no one speaks them, they do not die. They only wait. Thank you for watching. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because the darkest secrets aren't born in shadows alone. They survive in silence, in the choice to look away.